She has had careers that have sent her all over the world and allowed her to serve in urban communities that have inspired her to contribute to the world in significant ways. In 2021, Elle became the first Black historical romance author for Harlequin with her novel, A Blues Singer to Redeem Him. Her novel was only the second historical romance novel for Harlequin to feature a Black woman. She also published 2 novellas with a smaller publisher prior to the publication of A Blues Singer to Redeem Him, and self-published a YA fantasy novel that hit multiple best-selling lists. She holds a doctorate in educational leadership from Baker University, a Master of Fine Arts in Writing Popular Fiction from Seton Hall University, and a Master of Arts in Teaching from Pittsburgh State University. Currently, she is a principal in Kansas City, Kansas, where she gets to spend a lot of time working with amazing teachers, students, and families to achieve amazing academic and social emotional growth. Welcome to Elle Jackson.
Wow, that was pretty good. Thank you. So if you didn't get logged into the guided note sheet, no problem. If you want it after, just let me know. I can email it to you. The other thing you have an option to do, you can also do it later. This will take you to a Padlet where you can type in questions you might have throughout our session. I consider this session kind of like a survey course because it goes over a lot of different things. So if you want more detail about anything or you have questions, feel free to type those in, but you can also just ask them at the end of the session. So one of the first things I wanted to do to kind of center our learning for today was to discuss some of the important reasons why we still write historical romance. And this quote from Beverly Jenkins, who's like a masterful historical romance author, and she's prolific and amazing, and one of my favorite books of hers is Indigo, and this is a quote from that. Hester thought about the political upheaval gripping the country and said, "These are serious times." Yes, they are, which is why it's important to seek out humor and beauty whenever possible. If we don't, we'll all be buried beneath the weight of the misery. We have a lot going on in our world constantly, and I think one of the most amazing things about historical romance is that there is beauty and there's love no matter what is going on at the time. And it helps us to remember that. It helps us to remember that we can steep ourselves and focus on the beauty around us. So today, our time together, we're going to discuss what is romance, the spectrum of historical fiction, what is historical romance, on writing romance or the structure of how you write romance, romancing history, what do I mean by that? And then how do you start your research process? How do you make that fun? Again, I'm author Elle Jackson. I actually write fantasy, science fiction, and historical romance. I've been writing since middle school. My first story was about a little girl who knew that there were aliens taking over the school, and no one believed her. A lot of my writing, my early writing, came from feeling like an other, like I didn't belong, like I wasn't a part. And I think as I progressed as a writer, that idea of not belonging or not seeing myself continued. And so I started seeking out opportunities to write stories where I didn't see anyone like me. And that's how I became a writer. Some of the cool things I've gotten to do, so the way I became a Harlequin author, I actually was a Romance Includes You finalist in 2019 with the story that actually became A Blues Singer to Redeem Him. I was able to interview other historical romance authors for the LA Times, which was really cool. And I was a speaker for the Mensa, which is the High IQ National or International Society in 2022. So what is romance? The key is that there are lots of stories with romantic elements in them, and so we see it in several genres, like mystery, horror even has romantic elements. But the key for a story to be romance is that the romance is at the center of what's going on. Without that romantic element, there really is no story, or it's not a very interesting one. And you want to make sure that those relationship elements are the stars of this show. They're the core, they're emphasized, and that's what makes it a true romance versus a story with romantic elements. There are 4 components to romance. You have to have a main character who falls in love with at least one other character. There's several kinds of romances out there, but at least one character falling in love with one other character. There has to be a conflict that feels like a threat to that potential but burgeoning romance. And there also needs to be that once-in-a-lifetime epic kind of love. And of course, it has to have a happily ever after. Just a little history, because this is historical romance, so just a little history about romance. The oldest love story was actually a poem, which was sang for a marriage for the ruler, Shusen. The author is unknown. It's about 4,000 years old, probably older, and it was found originally in Nippur, which is now southern Iraq. The first mass market romance, as in the way we know romance, was published in 1740, and it was called Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. And it was about a young girl, and she was a maid servant, and she had her employer, who was much older, made advances toward her, and it did end happily ever after. I think looking at it from a modern lens, I'm not sure how we would feel about this, but this was our first mass market, as we know it, romance novel. So I'm an author with Harlequin and Mills and Boon. And Mills and Boon, which may be less known here in our country, but it is the largest publisher of romance in the UK, and it's a subsidiary of Harlequin. And actually, Mills and Boon published the first romance as we know it in 1909. So they were publishing before Harlequin was publishing. And Sophie Cole, Arrows from the Dark, was their first romance novel. And they didn't start as a romance publisher. They actually started as general fiction, and it just so happened that the first novel they published was romance, and it worked out. Romance is still doing really well in the UK. And then Harlequin came with their romance novel in 1949, The Manatee, and Avon actually is the first publisher of historical romance, The Black Moth by Georgette Heyer. And then Harlequin, following up to what Avon's success was, in 1977 came out with Eleanor and the Marquis. And I have a small piece of the history with historical romance as well, as already was stated. But yes, first Black historical author for Harlequin, which was really, I didn't know that. When I was first signed, I had no idea. Somebody told me. And I'm like, are you sure? Because it's like 2019. But they were like, yes. And then when my book was published in 2021, there was a book that came out earlier that year with the first Black female on a cover for Harlequin. And so my book was the second one. But they came out the same year. So what is historical romance? It's everything that romance is, but it's set in a historical period. And the general consensus is it's 50 plus years ago. So that's the general consensus, but I think there's some play around room within that. You don't have to make it such hard set rules. However, 50 plus years is kind of the general rule. One of the things that a lot of people may find a little bit of a barrier to approaching historical fiction or historical romance, and specifically, is how much history do I have to put in it? Do I have to be a history buff? Do I have to be a historian to write about history? And I will tell you that there is a range, there's a spectrum. You have historical fiction that is extremely accurate. It is very researched. It is factual with fictional elements to it. And then you have alternative history, which they've taken a historical period or a historical person or a conflict that happened, and they've changed it in some significant way. And it usually is so that it's speaking to what is it that, you're trying to say about the current society, but you're using the lens of history to make that statement. There are lots of questions that you can ask yourself if you are considering historical fiction, historical romance. Do you wish you could rewrite history? That was definitely something for me as a writer. There were aspects of history that are just extremely painful, to learn about. And you think that there are ways that you would want to rewrite that story or things you would want to change about it. You're leaning towards that alternative history end of that spectrum. Are there time periods that you wish you could experience firsthand? So for me, the Roaring '20s were just really interesting. The way my book came about, actually, it was my birthday, and I was downtown at a place called Tomstown. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are, but Tomstown has a they're steeped in our culture here in Kansas City, and they have a lot of history here in the city. And so I was learning a lot about what was going on with Tomstown and how they came to be, and it just was really intriguing. The mob impact in the city and the way they were controlling what was going on in the government. It was all very interesting to me. So that was actually, I started thinking about my story. I didn't know I was at that time, but I was. I started thinking about it. And then I realized that I was learning a lot about what happened in Tulsa with the race massacre. And that was something that I had never heard about. I didn't learn it in school, had no idea that that actually happened. I started to learn that there were things like that that happened all over, not just in Tulsa. But it was intriguing that I had never heard of this. Like, this was a part of our American history that was never talked about. And so you put that together, that interest in the Roaring '20s and wishing I could have worn those dresses and had those experiences. And you put that together with what was going on in the city at the time with the mob and the Ku Klux Klan, and that's how my story came to be. If you're someone who enjoys reading biographies and autobiographies, chances are you're going to lean more towards the historically accurate. And so you're probably someone who enjoys researching and looking at those details very deeply, internalizing that before you turn that into a story. Some of the questions that you might ask yourself as well would include, have you ever been called an old soul? Are you someone who has really connected to history, and you always have, even as a little child? Maybe you have a spirit of being here for a while. You're someone who people say, you're an old soul. That means you might have some of those values that we've had and we've held tight to culturally. And do you believe that history is timeless? Because I think that looking at the past and looking at who we were and where we've come from and the things that we've come through, I think it can always teach us more about who we are in this moment and who we're going to be in the future. So I'm going to take you through some media, because I think that when you're thinking about historical fiction, historical romance, you want to have visuals. You want to read. You want to take it in so that you can really start to internalize what was going on at that time. And so Hunters is actually alternative history, and it is Al Pacino, and the premise, well, I'll let you watch it, then we can chat.
My deepest sorrow is about your grandmother. We're in the camps together.
She lives through all that just to be shot in her living room by a burglar. It sounded like she knew him. It sounded...
Personal.
Yeah.
I suppose every murder is personal. You know what the best revenge is? Revenge. Your grandmother wished to protect you.
From what?
Nazis, Jonah. goddamn Nazis. There's evil living here. They're our neighbors.
They've blinded themselves to us. You can get away with anything in America.
So your grandmother and I created the hunters.
We put together a group of Nazi hunters.
We're a lockpicker, spy, soldier, master of disguise,
Showtime.
and 2 weapons experts.
We would bring God's justice. What do you say?
I want in.
Agent Morris, I think there's Nazis living in America, and someone out there's taking them out. There is a right way and a wrong way to get justice. You do this, you become the evil you are fighting.
They're broadcasting something.
It's a coded message.
We find them before they find us.
You're trying to save the world. There's a lot more where this came from.
I need to learn how to fight.
I know a few people, do you know?
Shows like Hunters and Boardwalk Empire, which we'll watch here in just a second, they start off with historical facts and they really just turn those into something suspenseful and meaningful. And they're saying something, like I said, about where we are currently, but it also speaks to where we have come from. And I think if you are considering historical fiction, historical romance, that's probably an interest of yours. And so I love historical romance. I love historical fiction because it can be very playful. You can take what really happened and then turn it on its head and make it something completely interesting and different than what is expected of that particular story. We've seen lots of media fiction that's come from like the Holocaust and post-Civil War or post-World War II. And it just really is something that there's books like Eli Knight's book about the Holocaust and being a prisoner during that time. But then you have shows like this that talks about how Nazis fled to the U.S., which is something that people think is actually true and actually happened. But if that is true, what if here in the U.S. we did something about that and we made sure that those individuals were hunted and they were taken care of? So it's just really cool to see how the same historical period or the same kind of ideas about history can be taken lots of different ways. And so you have lots of room to play with. And I'm not sure, I think I like the fact that I'm starting with something that actually did happen and I'm taking it to a different place. It helps me not feel so alone. As a writer, we can start with a blank page and we have no idea where we're going with it. But when you start with history, you actually do have a starting place. And it's a bit of comfort with writing a blues singer to redeem him. There were several titles to it before it came to that. But I'll stick with the one that actually got published. A blues singer to redeem him. My main character, she was actually someone who survived the Tulsa Race Massacre, and she moved to Kansas City after her parents were killed. And so it just gave her a lot of backstory, and it allowed me to introduce that to people who may not have ever heard of what happened in a way that was less intrusive, I felt like, because that's a heavy topic, a very heavy topic. But I didn't want to shy away from it, the heaviness of the time, the heaviness of the history, but I did want to make sure I was focused on the love story. And that's the thing about romance. You start with that heavy stuff, you start with those heavy backstories for your characters, and then you take them into this romance and you take them into something that is going to end well, which is comforting for readers. So do I have any Hunters viewers in here? Does anyone watch that show? you might start. Does anyone watch Boardwalk? Boardwalk is older. Let's see what they did with it.
Boys, Mr. Mayor, fellow members of the City Council, in less than 2 hours, liquor will be declared illegal by decree of the distinguished gentlemen of our nation's Congress. To those beautiful, ignorant bastards. Prohibition! We got a product the fellas gotta have.
Gotta figure we're putting out close to 2,000 crates a week, and that's just for starters.
Boats unload liquor sailed down from Canada, up from the Caribbean, across the Atlantic.
I supply the product, you and your people work your magic.
It is watered down, mixed with poisons, and sold by criminals for whom murder is a means of doing business.
Your friends from Chicago checked in, the New York gangs too.
January 16th, 8:03 p.m., Johnny Torrio meeting with Nucky Thompson.
Mr. Torrio?
Big Jim Colosimo, Arnold Rothstein, and Charlie Luciano.
Jimmy Darman. Al Capone. You guys gonna get into the liquor business too?
Your friend from New York, he just took us for 90 grand.
This is all him, Rothstein. He wants to muscle in, take over the liquor business.
Mr. Rothstein don't run this town.
No, he runs New York. Maybe you heard of it.
Nobody move! This is a raid.
It's an election year. We're in trouble.
You can't be half a gangster, Nucky. Not anymore.
This entire city, this Sodom, will be cleansed all at once.
You'd be very foolish to underestimate me.
So Boardwalk Empire is actually really close to the ideas that I had in my head for A Blues Singer to Redeem Him. It's those roaring 1920s, that mob life, those suits and the flapper dresses and the prohibition. And my main character definitely was involved in all of that. And it was intriguing to me. And so in order to get in the mood of that, which I'll talk about later when we start talking about how do you research for this, I needed to watch shows like that, and Harlem Nights, which is also set in the Roaring '20s, because I need those visuals. I need that in my head as I'm trying to create this world and immerse the reader in that space that they themselves may have never really experienced. I've never experienced it. So what are those ways that you can ensure that you have a really good understanding of what it looked like? What did it feel like? What was the tone that you're trying to create for that historical time period, those characters? How do you know that you're being true to that time, if that's your choice? Some, like I said, with alternative historical fiction, you may be veering away from some of those things that actually happened and going towards an alternative history. But for my purpose with A Blues Singer to Redeem Him, I was trying to be true to the time period and what it felt like to live through that. One of the probably best alternative history novels that I've read is by Justina Ireland, Dread Nation. She has a sequel to this, and I put up the Amazon description because I just thought it was so engaging. But I think one of the key things about her particular novel is, yes, it is alternative history. It has The Walking Dead in it. But she, again, she's starting from that actual place of what did happen, and she just put a twist in it. So what if the Civil War happened, but with Walking Dead? So it was cool. And I mean, I really enjoyed this novel. She's a masterful historian, though. I mean, her details, and it's just very much submersive, as it says there, but it's dark, it's gritty, and that's what you have to also think about when you're choosing the time period you're going to focus on. What is the tone? What are you trying to create? And I'll read just that first paragraph. At once provocative, terrifying, and darkly submersive, Dread Nation is Justina Ireland's stunning vision of an America both foreign and familiar. And so that foreign part are those alternative history facts that she added in, but she did it so well, it didn't seem like alternative history. It seemed like it could have really happened, which is a goal, I think, of historical fiction. A country on the brink at the explosive crossroads where race, humanity, and survival meet. So check that out if you haven't read it yet. So again, it's that continuum, that historically accurate to alternative history, and there's so much room in between. You don't have to choose one or the other. You can be somewhere in the middle, but you have options. So writing romance specifically. So one of the best structured books that I've read and has been referred to me by many romance writers is Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes. So we'll look at her structure and we'll look at another structure. And I actually have her book. I had her book. I'll find it. So there's 5 different main areas of the structure. The first is setup, and like with any story, you want to introduce your heroine, your hero, and you want to make sure that they are connected to each other in some way. And the traditional structure, which is what I'll talk to you about, it's not that you can't veer off of this, of course you can, but the traditional structure, you're going to have your 2 main characters that are going to eventually fall in love. You're going to have them meet pretty closely into that book. But the key, I think, maybe one of the main differences with romance in that beginning section of the novel is that you want to endear your reader to your hero and heroine. You want to connect them in some way. So how you introduce them is going to be really important. And then how they meet, it should be steamy. And it should be an instant kind of connection. Even if you're writing like a enemies to lovers kind of novel, you still want there to be something electric about when they first meet, because the reader needs to know like this could go somewhere, but the characters obviously don't know that. And then that brings you to that last part of the setup, which is that no way. They are thinking either out loud or internally, we would never be together. I will never fall in love with this person. And that starts the reader on the romance arc. So they have to start usually with this would never work out. And then throughout the course of the story, obviously, we get to that happily ever after, but it seems like it's just not possible. And then the adhesion is when they're thrown together some way for some reason. Maybe they get stuck on a ship together, or maybe they're both having to look for their best friend that one's little brother is the other one's best friend, and they're stuck finding that person together. There's something that brings them together, and they can't easily get apart. In my work in progress, he is my main hero comes when my heroine has just been shot. And he sees her bleeding out, and he wants to help her because the reason she was shot is because of his family. So he feels that burden of doing something. And he's very wealthy, so he has some of the best doctors, so he takes her with him, and he helps nurse her, but they don't get along. But they're stuck together for the time being. The second main overarching section of the structure is falling in love. An inkling is maybe this could work. Initially, that no way, you're going to turn it on its head. So whatever that no way reason is, you're going to start putting holes in that reason for your reader. If your main heroine is like, I could never date him, he's my little brother's best friend, and now you're going to see an inkling too that you're going to start throwing holes at that. Like, that's not a good enough reason. Maybe this could work out. And then they start deepening their desire for each other. That connection starts to show up on the page that can't be denied. And then we get to the midpoint of love, and we want to make sure that we get to that midpoint, and we want to make sure that the couples are starting to think that maybe their love is within reach. Maybe they can be together. Maybe this could work out. But of course, we know it might not. So we get to that fourth main overarching section, which is the retreat. So you get, it's like a roller coaster. That's the best way I can describe romance. It's really a roller coaster, or like a tug of war, because it's like, oh, I don't like you, I like you, I don't like you. So it's very much that back and forth. And you can see that in these very traditional structures around romance. Because, you know, as soon as we think maybe it'll work, maybe this is going to actually be great. No, actually, it's probably not. You get to that inkling of doubt, and it deepens, and it becomes so set in within those characters. Something significant has happened that they can't overcome it. At least that's what you want your reader to think. There is no overcoming this. They retreat from each other. They put their shields back up, which had just started to fall down. They put those shields back up. They may even break up officially. And then it keeps getting worse. It doesn't get better. It gets worse. It's the dark night of the soul. It's where they feel like all hope is lost. There's nothing that can be done to salvage this relationship. But then, because it's romance and it does have to end happily, they wake up. There's this redemption. There's something that happens, or that this grand gesture is done, and now all of a sudden they can see each other in the way that they really were meant to see each other. And it's what wholehearted looks like. I really love that, because it can't be a surface level gesture. It has to be something that's connected to your character's main motivations, and maybe even their insecurities about themselves and why that relationship wasn't going to work. The strings in romance are all interconnected. So what is it that the heroine feels insecure about? How does the hero initially make that worse for her? And then by the end, possibly he's been the mirror she needed to help her see herself in her, you know, who she really is. So romance can bring us along this journey and make us feel sad and happy, connected, disconnected, like we failed. It brings all of these emotions in so that we get that wonderfully amazing, bumpy romance arc. And what was really cool, because if you're thinking of writing a traditional romance, you're going to see structures that are just like the Romancing the Beach structure. They might use different words. And I put this one in because I thought maybe the wording of this one might speak to some people more so than even the Romancing the Beat, but it's all very similar. But the call to action, well, that's something most stories are going to have. They have to get into the events of the story, get into the conflict. But in a romance, you're going to refuse that call initially, so that no way. You're going to have that still. And then the acceptance of the quest, that's when they are that adhesion, that inkling, it might work, acceptance of the quest, giving the relationship a chance. And then they're going to have trials and tribulations, but trials and temptations. And I like that it's so specific. They go on 3 different dates. Possibly during this time when you're trying to show them that they're going to give the relationship a chance. Maybe it can really work. But then, of course, midpoint, I need you, but I can't have you. I really liked that, too, because that is the emotion that at least one of the characters may be feeling, or they might both be done with each other. But usually to promote that conflict, one of them might still be holding on just a little bit to what they could have. And then the roadblock, there's something that's there that they can't get past. Something happens that they just absolutely can't work through, like in my work in progress. My main character, like I said, he's the reason that she's shot. And then she finds out after they've, gotten close, they've deepened their connection. And now all of a sudden she finds out that he's been lying. And he's actually the reason that she was shot. So that's something that, it has to be something that seems insurmountable, seems like they will not get past this. That's the key. and then the fall into the dark moment or the dark night of the soul. They break up. One of them is going to have to make a sacrifice. One of them is going to have to give in and meet that person where they are. Someone's going to have to come towards the middle so that they can get back connected. And then the declaration of love, someone has to have that grand gesture, and then the denouement, or the happily ever after. Some of the romance authors that really stand out to me as playing within that structure really well for historical romance. Like I said, Beverly Jenkins, she writes different time periods, but mainly pre-Civil War. Eloisa James, she writes in that Georgian period, and Vanessa Riley is Regency, and there's lots of other authors writing in these areas as well, but these are some of the books that I would say follow that more traditional structure of a novel. And I was privileged to interview Eloisa James and Vanessa Riley for the LA Times. So there's 3 ways you can romance history. You can have a fictional event, but real people. Real events, but fictional people. Real events and real people, but the plot scenes and the dialogue are completely made up. I think a fear that some people may have when thinking about writing historical fiction and thinking about writing about real people is being sued. If the people are still around in some way, or maybe their family might have some opinion of what you're writing. So you have to be careful with that if you do choose to write about real people, but it can be done and it's done well. You just have to make sure that you're being historically accurate if you're going to write about real people, or that it's so far in the past that it really doesn't matter anymore. And that's the lovely thing about history, because that is an option too. I want to go back here just for a second. I think the play on words, romancing history, it's not making light of history. So I want to be clear about that. It's not making light of history. It's not taking away from the seriousness of history and what has happened. It's just remembering that there was beauty. Even in all the ugliness of whatever time period you may choose, there was beauty, there was love. And that's why historical fiction will always be a significant part of what we read, what we take in. There's several time periods. I'll just briefly cover these. There's more than this. This was just a list that came up when I was researching about, the time periods readers are really interested in, not necessarily what writers are writing in, but what readers are interested in reading about. And the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, if you're looking for a more grittier time period that you want to write in, then you might consider the Middle Ages. It came after a great loss of power, and so there's lots of different climactic events, important people that you could write about during the Middle Ages. Ancient Greece is actually broken down into 3 different areas, but overall, that time period is known for art, architecture, philosophy. Ancient Greece is a fun one because you get to write about the beauty and about the creation of, and about being really, I think of original art when I think of ancient Greece. And then there's the Golden Age, and the Golden Age came to different countries or different places at different times, but generally it was over by the 17th century, and it was characterized by a peak in achievement and what was happening within those separate cultures. And really it was just, this is the peak of that civilization and their achievements. And then the Roaring Twenties, one of my favorites, 1920 to 1929. Again, you've got mobsters, you've got illegal activity, flapper girls, all kind of stuff. Wonderful wardrobes and just a lot of fun to play with the Roaring Twenties, and a lot of conflict to play with as well. And then you have World War I, World War II. World War I was, and both of them, World War I and II were global conflicts. World War II, I think people are still, very much fascinated about what happened just because it's so unbelievable what happened. 40 to 50,000 people died during that time. Oops. And then we have the Renaissance or Victorian era, Renaissance, ancient Egypt, the Wild West, which the Wild West has taken kind of a back seat here in the most recent years with publishing as far as romance goes. But I do think that it's reemerging. And so I'm considering writing a Western. Some of the current bestsellers, Miss Fleming Falls in Love by Emma Melbourne. And this is where you get into the female protagonist is seen as someone for that time period who is very much counter to what may have been expected at the time. So the main female character in Miss Fleming Falls in Love, she's not a typical young lady. The Earl of Langley soon finds that out when he tries to collect her father's debt from her. And so that is a common theme throughout historical romances that if it is a female lead in the romance, she typically is going to stand up against those structures that have been put in place to try to control the females at that time. And that's actually, it's the same for The Prize, which is a medieval romance, and it's about an unexpected love between a Saxon woman and a warrior. And then we also have, I can't read that up there, Eyes of Silver, Eyes of Gold by Ellen O'Connell. And this is more of a family conflict. It's set in 1865. This is a Wild West story. And in those Westerns, often you will see the theme of family being that one of the major conflicts around the relationship that's trying to flourish. So let's get into some of the research. So there are 5 steps, though each step is very involved. But generally there is about 5 steps that I go through to start writing. I will do a lot of research, and that I'm going to go through in just a second, but there are multiple ways to research. There really is not just one way, and there's so much out there now we have at our fingertips that we can learn about and see and take in and immerse ourselves. So that's what that first step is really about, immersing yourselves in the different time periods to see what you really want to write. What can sustain your attention? What do you really want to bring to life? And what kind of characters can you create with that time period? The next step is to read fiction set in those time periods. You always want to do that as a writer anyway. Just read in the genre that you're writing or planning to write. But also don't forget, we have movies, we have TV shows that you can watch as well to get an idea of those time periods. Documentaries would be a part of your research. But I think that it does give you those visuals that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. And then for me, I try to narrow because I can get all over the place. Like I want to write in every single time period. So I just try to narrow my focus down to 3 either settings, or maybe I've come up with some characters that are from different time periods that I want to write about. And then I start free writing. I call myself an exploratory writer. I'm not a pantser. I'm an exploratory writer. So I start free writing, timed writing, to try and make that character come to life for me, or that setting or that time period come to life for me. And when I'm researching, so again, history is so heavy. Some of the things that have happened are so painful to learn about. But I try to remind myself of a quote from Beverly Jenkins. She said, "I have to remind myself at times that our lives aren't always focused on the pain. There was joy and love too." That's me and Beverly Jenkins when I was completing my MFA at Seton Hill. She was one of our speakers. So some things you might want to research if you're going to write historical romance. So if you're writing where there might be royal titles involved, you want to make sure that if you are going to stay true to the history of that time period, that you understand the titles, you understand if you're going to pull in some military, you understand the ranks behind that. You always want to immerse yourself in the clothing and the food of the time, things that make that atmospheric emotion behind what your reader is going to experience. Because again, we read historical fiction because we want to go back in time to these places. We want to feel like we're part of that world. And there's lots of ways to do that. And some of the most basic things that we do in our everyday lives is what you can find out and put in small little details. It doesn't have to be big blocks of description or anything like that. Like, it's just the small details that you're going to include to help bring your reader into that time period. Transportation methods, always fun to think about, because what we have now as transportation is just so far and so different than where it all started. And so bringing in how are your characters getting around is just one way that you can immerse your reader in the world. Tools that we used for cooking in that time period may be very different than what we use now. Looking at true events, things that actually did happen that might spark some sort of conflict for you. And it might not be something that actually shows up in real time in your story, but it might just be playing out in the background. And then the morality of the time. So that's how we get those females who are standing up against those expectations. They're going to go against what society is telling them they should be doing. And so you start to research and look into what was expected, what was considered moral behavior in that time period. So when you're researching, there's two kinds of sources that you're going to encounter: your primary and secondary resources. That firsthand information, it might look like, you might go to a historical society and read some journals of someone who lived during that time period. There's lots of different kinds of primary sources of information, and then there's secondary sources of information who another researcher has compiled and put together that information that you're encountering. Some primary sources, like I said, might be surveys and questionnaires, observational studies, interviews, and focus groups. These are things that you might encounter in that, and when you're looking at primary sources, journals, things like that. Secondary sources, books, articles, documentaries, fiction based on history is all a part of your research. Some fun ways that I found to get into it, because if you're not a researcher, that's okay. You can still become a historical romance writer. You don't have to be a historian. I'm not a historian. I am a student of history. That's how I like to say it, because I do enjoy learning. I enjoy learning, and so learning about history is just one of the ways that I fill up my time. Not that I have a lot of extra time, but because I don't have a lot of extra time, reading children's books on world history, like, that's one of the easiest ways to get your feet wet and to start the journey of learning about what you might turn into a story. And it's not a huge time commitment because it's a children's book. And so usually they have summarized that and condensed it to make it very relatable for children. And so that's one way you can start. Look for those climactic events in history. We probably could rattle off several just from our education, but look for those things that maybe we aren't talking about, maybe we didn't know about, and that we should be talking about. Like I said, that's one of the main catalysts for me writing A Blues Singer to Redeem Him was the Tulsa Race Massacre, which I hadn't heard about. But since my book, there's been multiple TV shows, Lovecraft Country and others. There was a book and a TV show based on called Lovecraft Country, and it's actually references the Tulsa Race Massacre even more than my book did. But initially, there really wasn't anyone talking about that. Keep a visual journal. I'm a visual person, so Pinterest, Google Docs, Idea Webs, those are my jam, and it's where I will start to funnel the information that I'm getting from my research to try to make sense of it. But visually is not the only way that you can collect what you are learning. You can do it based on whatever your learning preference is, and there are several learning styles, but here are a few. So if you're a visual person, you can create a vision board. Pinterest is a great way. It's online. There's no, you don't have to purchase anything. But if you are a more kinesthetic, hands-on person, then maybe you're creating a scrapbook, and maybe you are getting pictures and you're printing them off and you're cutting them out and you're putting together this scrapbook of your time period, or based on your particular character, if your character has emerged to you already. If you're auditory, maybe you create audio recordings of what you're learning so that you can listen back to those. You're listening to different recordings of that time period to help get you in that space to write that story. And then if you're, reading and writing is your preferred learning style, then you're creating maybe a journal, or you're just keeping notes and keeping track written of what you have learned throughout your research. We have about 9 minutes left, so I want to make sure I get to questions. But this is how you can connect with me. I am on all three, but I am not very active on all three. But you are welcome to reach out to me. Author Elle Jackson, and I don't know why I have 3 different ones. I'll work on that. Author Elle Jackson is Facebook, Twitter is Read Elle Jackson, and Instagram is Elle Jackson Writes. These are some of the sources that I cited. I had like a lot of sources, but here are a few. And now we can go to our Q&A. No one put questions in. Does anyone have questions? There you go.
How do you find time to do principal and write?
That's such a great question. I haven't figured that quite out yet. My second book is taking forever for me to finish because of that. I actually stepped away from education for 2 years. I was a professor for a couple of years, and that did allow more time than being a principal, but I just went back this school year to become a principal again. And time is hard. So what I decided was that if I write every day, even if it's just for 5 minutes, then I can feel successful. So I have a habit tracker, and I write every day. Even like I said, even if it's just for 5 minutes.
So do you choose a specific time to write during the day, or?
It's at night,
Okay.
after my little ones go to sleep.
Wow.
But it's not bad because I'm writing something I'm interested in, so that makes it easier. And it helps me process through things. And so I can put a lot of the emotion that comes with being an educator, I can put that into my story. And that's helpful. It's almost therapeutic. So it doesn't feel like another thing I have to do. It actually feels like just a part of ending my day.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the kind of story, the real events and real people, but plot, dialogue, or fictional.
Yep.
Is there a name for that kind of book, or?
As far as historical fiction goes? So, no, not necessarily, but no, not.
Okay, total, it's
Create-
like writing fiction.
It is.
But you have the real facts.
Yes.
in there.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So like I said, Beverly Jenkins is masterful at this, but it plays out in the background of her story. Like what actually is going on during that time period, it's playing out in the background. For my story, it was the backstory for my character, plus it was a lot of the conflict, the external conflict of my story was what was going on during that time. So that racial undertones and all of that, because my heroine was Black and my hero was white. So that was like an automatic conflict for them because of the time period. So it's really just finding those ways to play with that conflict that the time period is going to create. And if it's a person, it's not a biography because it's fiction, but it's historical fiction.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you want to say A Blue Singer Review? It was my first true romance book that I read. Loved it. So if you've not read it, pick it up.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I appreciate that.
I'm curious to know, for you, what comes first, the history inspiring you, or you have a story and then you piece it into history?
So it depends. So when I'm writing historical romance, the time period comes first for me. And then I think of a character that might be really interesting to follow through that time. And like I said, with the Blues Singer, to redeem him, like it really was that Tulsa Race Massacre. And I was trying to figure out, I didn't want to write about it. I didn't want to go into it, but I wanted to have it as a piece of who my character was. And I did know that initially when I started writing. But with like science fiction and fantasy, the character comes first for me. So it just depends. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, the topic, to me, you're an educator, but I think about how many things get eliminated that we teach kids.
Yes.
Because the race massacre was taught when I was in school.
Was it?
So I knew about that.
Wow.
You know, but now it's like, well then, I talk to kids that know nothing of the Holocaust.
Nothing.
So things kind of get dropped off.
Yes.
But this would be a beautiful way to keep those pieces moving forward so that, we can't maybe remember everything.
Right.
We can remember this happened and this happened to people.
Yes.
You know? So
I love that. This happened to people.
Right.
Like people, yes.
I mean, so I think this is a beautiful way. This isn't my genre, but I wanted to mention this.
Yeah.
So I just think this is a beautiful way to take things and just keep bringing them forward.
To make sure we never forget.
And make sure we never forget.
Yeah. Actually, as a teacher, I taught the Holocaust. So, Night, that was Elie Wiesel's book. I couldn't remember that earlier. Sorry about that. I taught Night, and I taught about the Holocaust, which my students had no clue. And they were 6th graders. They did not know. They had never heard of it. They actually thought I was lying. They didn't believe that something like that could happen.
What age were the kids?
6th grade. Yeah. They thought, they were like, this could not have happened. Like, that's not no, that couldn't have happened. But I'm like, yes, things like this have happened all throughout history, like over and over, which is why we cannot forget. Yeah, for sure. Yep. Any other questions? Thank you all so much. Now I can leave that there.